I want to go to move beyond that unless anyone else wants to add anything to that. Maybe I don't know if you want to add anything to that, or Robert. I want to go to what all of us can probably have a conversation about. What do we think are some of the, as we enter 2016, what geopolitical things out there we need to keep on our radar that has the potential to be a disrupting element, whether it's war or what have you, that we need to really look at. The Middle East certainly is, the terrorism angle clearly is something that we talked about this morning in another capacity that we all are concerned about. Is that something that's going to blow up further than it is right now? Mehdi, you can probably speak to that a little bit in terms of what's going on. This row between Saudi and the Iranians, help us to understand what's going on there. We see them from where we sit as all being Arabs. What is the issue, or Muslims? What is the issue or the concern?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. Look, I'm originally Iranian, so everything I say good about Iran, don't think that I'm unbiased.
Yeah.
So, usually Iranians think that they don't define themselves as Middle Eastern. Mm-hmm. They think they are different, they are better than other nations, and this was just a historical mistake to place them in the middle of Middle East. They have to be next to Switzerland or Switzerland or something. It was some sort of, unintentional mistake by this study. But if you travel to Middle East, you would see the difference between Iran and other countries. For example, when we are talking about Turkey, yesterday you saw in the news that there was an explosion in one of the most important tourist neighborhood in Istanbul. We did not have such an incident in Iran, never ever. Which means that despite all you hear in the news about, dictatorship or religious dictatorship in Iran, Iran is quite a stable country, even comparing to Turkey. Iran is suffering from economic sanctions, not because of nuclear program, but also because of the state sponsorship of terrorism since 1979 after they seized the US embassy. So it's not easy in Iran to use major credit cards because the Iranian economy is not connected to the world economy. Despite all these problems, when you compare it to Turkey, Turkey is like a European country, you can travel easily, you can find your way if you haven't been there, but you are a good traveler. But in Iran, it has been a closed country for such a long time. The tourism business has been down for about 4 decades for different reasons. But still, the country is, first of all, it's the most pro-American and pro-Western country in the Middle East, and this is one of the ironies. The government is so anti-American, but the society is the most I'm not saying pro-Western, pro-American, pro-American country in the Middle East. And also, if you walk on the street of Tehran or major city in Iran, you wouldn't feel that you are walking on an Islamic city. It's, I traveled a lot in all countries in the Middle East, that Muslims have 5 times pray calls, if in the morning, at noon, in the evening. Everywhere you are, in Dubai, in Istanbul, if you are in the hotel, you would hear the voice of azan or the call for prayer. You would rarely hear it in Tehran. And actually, if you walk on the streets of Tehran and look at women, despite the fact that hijab or veil is imposed on people by the government, and that sometimes the government, the police forces harass women for not respecting the regulations, they have fashionize the hijab in a very strange way. So, and they made Tehran, I think, I traveled to, different cities. I was in Tel Aviv, Istanbul, different, I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia, but Tehran is the most erotic city in the Middle East. And the underground culture is so rich and so powerful that you cannot say that it is underground. It's actually underground. And the government's ideological, cultural agenda has failed totally. So we are talking about an exceptional country. When we say Muslim countries or Muslims, we think that they are all the same. In Saudi Arabia, women are not able to drive. In whole the country, there is no theater. So if you want to go to watch a cinema, a movie, there is no cinema in the country. Everything has to, all entertainments are limited to what you have at home. But Iran is has the cinema industry in Iran is one of the best in the world. So the country is totally different. And with all what's happening now in the region, the chaos in Syria, the political crisis in Iraq, in Yemen, and in Lebanon, and everywhere, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, I think Iran is the most stable and country, and in terms of economy, I think I wouldn't say that it's safe for oil companies or big companies to go there and invest now after the nuclear agreement, but in terms of safety and security, it seems to me that Iran is safer than many other places. And I can elaborate on this one. Just one more point. There is a rivalry between Iran and other powers in the region, including Saudi Arabia. But Iranian leadership, they are so cautious not to let this confrontation to take place on the Iranian territory. So they fight against Saudis, they fight against their enemies, but not on Iranian territories. On Yemen, in Syria, on Lebanon, and elsewhere.
So proxy.
Yes.
It's a way. So do you see it getting? You don't see it getting to getting out of hand in terms of the relationship?
No. Iranians are so cautious to keep the tensions manageable.
Yeah. Okay. I want to go back to Carmel and bring up the issue of as the U.S. presidential elections continue, there seems to be I want to say except Hillary, there seems to be a dearth of understanding of the rest of the world. Why do you think that is? Is it just this round that is the case? And Robert, you're an American, you can certainly jump in as you wish. Particularly on the Republican side, I should say.
Yeah.
There seems to be a lack of real appreciation, maybe except Jeb, but he's as what's the name say, he has low energy, he's not going anywhere. There seems to be a lack of appreciation for the rest of the world, and they want to build walls, they want to keep people out. How is that going to affect things going forward in terms of the country? And particularly how to see the rest of us, the rest of the world?
Yeah, I do think that, first of all, thanks for having me and
Sure.
give me the chance to experience this little slice of heaven here in BVI. CAP is a progressive policy think tank. Our mission is to provide policy ideas to progressive government actors. We put out our ideas for all to consume, but not surprisingly, Democratic policymakers are more likely to pick up on our ideas, and many of us, including myself, have formerly worked for Democratic politicians, including the president. So I say all that just to say, we're as an organization. First of all, to also express that I answer these questions with some degree of bias that I want to be transparent about, but also to say that we don't endorse any particular political party, but rather a progressive vision for America. I think this upcoming election is going to be extremely consequential, and I think the issue you're asking about is one of several reasons why. I think the American people are going to be presented with a very stark decision in terms of the visions being put forth by the candidates, regardless of the results of the primary. The conservative vision for America versus the progressive vision of America, I would argue, is very divergent, and I would say more so than we've seen in recent elections. I think people like Mitt Romney, John McCain, the Bushes are very conservative individuals, but in those previous election cycles, I think we saw greater degrees of convergence between the candidates. I think here, again, regardless of who wins the primary, we're going to see very different visions, including with respect to national security and how to deal with the global community. I think Trump is a little bit of a wild card, and the reason I say that is, he's very interesting for many reasons, but I think one of the things that's interesting about him is he's hard to pin down. I think that's purposeful. He doesn't put out a lot of policy detail, but he does have hints of supporting universal health care, hints where he's much more liberal than his Republican colleagues. He was opposed and continues to be opposed to the Iraq War. He talks about the need for universal, he has to say he wants to kill Obamacare, but he supports universal health care. He's defensive of big social programs like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. But then on the other hand, you see him driving his party, which seems hard to imagine, even further right on some issues like immigration and calling for mass deportations and speaking in a xenophobic way. So I would argue that his philosophy, his driving philosophy, is being opportunistic, which makes sense, right? The guy is basically a marketer at his core. But I do think within the Republican Party candidates, you see this almost bipolar so they're mostly aligned along a very conservative agenda, but with respect to national security and dealing with the world, they're a little bit bipolar in that there's some candidates who are calling for greater engagement, a return to a very neoconservative, quick action towards military action. I mean, if you look at what Lindsey Graham is talking about, he basically wants to start 4 new wars. On the other side of the equation, though, a lot of the candidates, the Rand Pauls of the world, perhaps Trump, are calling for a return to pre-World War II isolationism, which will obviously have great ramifications in terms of the global economy, but also in terms of security issues like how we tackle ISIS and terrorism worldwide. I would say, again, with a degree of bias, that the progressive candidates, I think, have a much more even-keeled perspective in terms of how they plan to engage with the world. I would argue that those candidates, whoever wins the primary, will position the United States in a much more effective way in terms of dealing with real challenges like climate change, terrorism, but also in terms of the global economy. I think you see in both of those candidates a push for a return to what we call middle-out economics, which is rebuilding the American middle class. Some economists have identified that if you look, again, post-World War II, the American economy has grown at substantially greater rates when progressives have been in the presidency versus when conservatives are in the presidency. We would argue at the Center for American Progress that is because progressives are more likely to push a middle-out view of the economy versus a trickle-down view of the economy. So I think that's one of many ways that if a progressive ends up in the presidency, it will be a positive for the global community and obviously, in my opinion, much better for Americans from an economic standpoint. I think immigration is an area where the contrast is so stark. Should we fix our broken immigration system, find a path to citizenship for the 10 million people who are really Americans? They're working hard, they have jobs, they're contributing to the economy. Or should we build a $100 billion wall that isn't really going to be effective and have mass deportation? I think the immigration issue, I don't need to tell you all, is particularly important for the Caribbean and BVI in particular, not just because it will determine how we deal with the 11 million people currently in the United States, but it'll also have great implications in terms of people looking to legally immigrate, whether it's because of need for pursuing education or business interests. So I'll stop there, but I think there's big consequences attached to this election.
Thanks, Russell, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really interesting. Karma has such a great command of the issues, and what you just heard was a very coherent, very balanced summation of where the positions of the parties. And I'm not going to get into the fact that the Republicans are dealing with a very narrow and sort of fundamentalist base right now, which they've walked into over a period of about 30 years. But the fact of the matter is, I'm going to drag this back to communications, is what you see now every day, the candidates are forced to respond to sound bites from social media. And social media brings a disintermediation to the political process that just keeps growing, and today is unprecedented. So that you never get this kind of well-reasoned, balanced summation of the issues. And the candidates are never presented that way. So it's Trump saying one outrageous thing after another, the other candidates responding on both sides, the evening news or social media magnifying this. And this gets to brand and brand control, because the communication between brands and their intended audiences today is completely disrupted. It's very difficult to get through, and there are two aspects to this. One is technology. One is the fact in China you have Weibo, you have WeChat, you have Facebook in this country, in the West, you have Twitter. And what it means is, and then there's another component, the technology and people's thinking about brands continues to evolve away from the brands themselves. So the landscape is littered with disrupted brands, from Kodak to Radio Shack to Digital Equipment Corporation to Oldsmobile and Pontiac, and you can go on. And it's because of two things. One is the technology, and the other is you have the millennial mindset. And millennials today, and this goes to the Chinese consumer. Chinese consumers, the high net worth individuals that BVI is targeting, are very much in this mindset of they're skeptical, they want authenticity, they look askance at institutions, so they're a very hard sell. So they take these messages, they look at them, they go into chat rooms, they have their own communities to talk about them, and they either accept or reject. And I think there's a phrase that Prophet, which is a brand consultant, uses, which is a brand needs to have relentless relevance, and it needs to be innovative, and it needs to make a connection with consumers about unchaining breakthrough solutions and insights, and to be constantly relevant to them. And I think that's what needs to happen.
Carson, I'm sure it's interesting from where you sit. How does all of that that's going on in the U.S., what does it look like from the other side of the Pacific?
Speaking as a Chinese first, I served 3 terms in the Chinese Parliament, so I know a little bit about how they see the world and the worldview, etc. I think to the Chinese, relationship between the U.S., between Washington and Beijing, cannot get too good, cannot get too bad. That's what every one of them would have said. It can't wreck because we depend on each other too much. At the same time, because there are competitive, some fundamental differences in ideology, in the economics, etc., it can't get too good either. So whoever becomes president, every time in a presidential election, China becomes the subject to be whipped. But the real thing is when the president comes out, the new president comes out, very often then one of the first visits will be to Beijing. So I think the Chinese would look at the election with that mindset. Whatever happens, things can't get too good, things can't get too bad either. But to me, Hillary Clinton, I mean, there are candidates who talk about China for the votes, because that's that is good for electioneering. But to me, Hillary Clinton has been tough for a long time. I mean, so his toughness towards China is less for electioneering, but more for a fundamental view as to how China should be contained, why pivot back to Asia, etc. And I suppose Beijing may have similar views of her because they would have dealt with her for over a decade, both when she was in the White House, in the State Department, and that probably is how they would see her.
We talked a little bit about the Republican side, and let's switch a little bit to, clearly Hillary seems to be the dominant player on the Democratic side, although Bernie seems to be causing us some heartburn. He seems to be rising in Iowa, which for whatever reason, and similarly he's from Vermont, so he should do well in New Hampshire. Do you think what happens if she loses? Well, her husband did, both, and then went and did very well. What do you think? How do you think that'll play out?
Well,
Or you think she's the preemptive nominee?
I do think it. I think in the end she is
will.
the one who will win the Democratic primary. I mean, you can never say never, but I think first of all I would say that I think Senator Sanders' positive performance in some ways has a positive impact for Hillary Clinton in that I think her running away with this without any fight could be a negative for her, particularly going into the election. So I think there could be some arguments for why this is a positive thing. I think he's likely to perform well in Iowa and New Hampshire. I think after that it's going to get more and more challenging for him because he, like most presidential candidates, that's where they've invested the time and energy, and he doesn't have the kind of infrastructure that Hillary Clinton has or the other many of the other candidates have on the Republican side. So I think he might have I think it's likely he'll show strong in Iowa, likely to win New Hampshire, but I think we'll see things change pretty quickly after that. I think in terms of why is he doing so well, hard to say for sure, but it does seem that the American people their view of politicians is at an all-time low. We recently did a research project at CAP where we looked at why is it that people don't seem to like government very much in the United States, and they like their local government the most, but it gets quickly diminishes as you get to the federal level, and it seems that they feel like government's not working for them. It's working for rich and corporate interests. That seems to be the biggest complaint that the American people have on both sides of the aisle. Something that's very popular in the polling is raising taxes on rich people, not to do anything with the money, but just to take it back. So I think that explains, is a little bit of the explanation as to both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump's rise in the polls in the respective parties, because although Bernie Sanders is a career politician, he presents as the non-politician politician. And he has called himself a socialist, so he's pretty outside the box. And then on the other hand, Trump is the consummate non-politician politician. Everything about him is a non-politician. So I think on both sides there's this populist trend to seek out the non-politician, and it makes it very hard for the Hillary Clintons and the Jeb Bushes of the world to ever scratch that itch for folks. But I do think as you see us getting closer to decision making in the primary process, that you will see the more traditional candidates coming back in, and when people really say to themselves, do I want Donald Trump to be my president, I think you'll see different decision making happening.
Okay, I mean, to turn to questions. One final question though, how do you see Hillary Clinton's presidency divergent from Obama's, if any? She clearly seems to be, my thinking is she clearly seems to be a little bit more, Lorna left, muscular as it relates to foreign affairs. Are there other?
Yeah, I think she will, I think there'll be a lot of things that are similar. I think their economic philosophy is very similar. I do think her experience as Secretary of State and frankly as former First Lady will position her to be, I would argue, the most qualified president we've ever had in terms of dealing with global affairs. And I think pivot to Asia is bad terminology, right? There needed to be a rebalancing of American foreign policy that gave much more attention to Asia. I would argue that the president, despite being pulled back into the Middle East, has done quite a good job of helping us move towards that rebalance. I think she will continue that trend. And I think there's some key important differences between her policy proposals and some of those of the president, but I do think that she is very well positioned to continue to drive, again, a middle-out driven economic agenda to engage in the world in a very robust and positive way, where she's relying on building alliances to tackle tough challenges of our time. So I think there'll be some differences, but.
I wanted to switch to questions. Dawn?
Yes. Thank you, Russell. Are there any questions for this panel?
Everybody's comfortable. There's going to be no war, so we're going to be fine. Just let's get past Donald Trump. Is that it? And then we'll get on, and life should be fine. Yeah. Okay.
Elise, you wanted to.
I can ask a few more if you. Yeah, go on.
I just want us to tie these global trends to the BVI, and what impact do you see these trends having in terms, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, what is happening in the US? How do these trends fit into the BVI and where we should go?
Yeah, if I take a lightning round, Carson, how do you see?
Yeah, I think it can only, so far as the Belt and Road is concerned, it can only be good for the BVI for various reasons. One, we are looking at about a month ago, I was speaking at what's called the Silk Road International Investment Forum in Hong Kong, because a new Chamber of Commerce has been formed called the Silk Road Chamber of International Commerce, and that is formed by ICC members along the 65 countries. So there are about 40 international Chamber of Commerce chapters from across the 65 countries, forming a new association called the Silk Road Chamber of International. I was speaking at the opening, and I was talking about One Belt, One Road and the digital bank and all that, and the reaction is overwhelming. That and I think with the Chinese having quite a lot of experience with BVI companies, when they go and build across the Belt and Road and finance those projects, then a lot of BVI companies will be used as part of that process. But looking at the map a few days ago, another idea sort of struck me. You see, if you go from Beijing to Europe, all the Central Asian countries are Islamic countries. The Middle Eastern countries are mostly Islamic countries. Down in Southeast Asia on the Silk Road, the Maritime Silk Road, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, these are all Islamic countries as well. So there may be a market for Sharia compliant products if they come out from the BVI. That when there may be Islamic finance opportunities out there that BVI, by designing products that may fit into financing across those countries, that may be an opportunity as well.
I guess I would say, I think there's many reasons that the presidential election in the United States will have big consequences for BVI and the global economic community. I mentioned briefly immigration, because there are such stark positions of the two parties. I think the two biggest implications for BVI of the election are what's going to happen with the U.S. economy. I don't think I need to explain to people in this room why that will have implications for BVI and really globally if we return to the failed economic trickle-down policies of George Bush and have another global U.S. recession, which will have implications for the global economy and for tourism to places like BVI. I think the other big top-tier issue I would say for BVI is how the United States proceeds in terms of how we handle climate change. One party doesn't believe it's happening, So they're not going to put forth an agenda to move forward. I would say even more disturbingly, they're not likely to put forth a positive agenda for investing in clean energy and diversification, but they're putting hurdles in the way of private actors moving in that direction, where under a progressive president, we will see real investments in that diversification and a very aggressive effort to work with, in partnership with people around the world to figure out how we can reduce carbon emissions and tackle climate change in a very real way.
Robert?
I think the unprecedented amount of private wealth coming out of China for the foreseeable future will give the BVI a great opportunity. And in addition to that, there's ASEAN, which is also going to help the BVI. And I think the creation of a bank, just for starters, will show the Chinese that there's a commitment on the part of BVI to their country and to the region. And I think that's going to benefit the BVI tremendously.
Mehdi?
I
Any
have
thoughts?
no expertise on this.
Yeah,
No.
okay.
Well,
Any questions?
oh, Mally, that's you? Okay. Question?
Hello. One of the things that you mentioned, the impact of the economy and immigration on the BVI, but over the past year, FATCA has come into effect. And I think taxes is one of the crucial issues that will be affecting the territory's economy, given our financial services industry. What do you think will happen in terms of who is elected, whether it's a Republican or Democrat? We know from past history that when a Republican is in office, it seems to be a little bit less regulatory pressures when it comes to taxation from a financial services perspective.
I do think that the two parties have very divergent views on that. I do think that the Democratic candidates are very focused on ensuring that we are enforcing the regulatory structure we have. There's a great interest on the Democratic side to ensure that income that should be taxed is being taxed and that people aren't taking advantage of loopholes. And in stark contrast, I do think the Republican candidates are very focused on undoing a lot of the regulatory reforms that we saw put in place after the financial crisis. I guess I do appreciate that will have implications for BVI. I think big picture, the chances for a big tax reform package getting through Congress, regardless of who's elected in the short term, will be extremely difficult because those issues there are such great differences in perspective. I do think the American people, as I said earlier, are demanding candidates of all political parties to figure out how to keep investments in the United States. So I think that's something that we'll see in the general. You might see both candidates talking about that, not just the Democratic candidate. I think big picture, I would argue that, I would take issue with the idea that as Republicans say, that the problem in our economy is overregulation, but again would point to when economic policies are focused on ensuring that all Americans are benefiting from economic growth, which has not been the case in recent years, are ones that will help drive a healthy middle class, help with upward mobility, which will create a healthier U.S. economy, and I think that will have ramifications for BVI and the global economy that will outweigh any changes made to the tax code specifically. But
Thank you. I believe that's it for questions, and I would like to thank you, Russell, and of course your esteemed panel for doing such a wonderful job in bringing those international issues home to us, and thank you again.
Good.